Namaskar, students and friends. As the topic is given to us today is 18th century India. I don't want to just go into the details of the 18th century without asking some basic critical questions. So what comes to your mind when we think of 18th century? What has happened in India even before 18th century for that matter? And there are many historians who worked extensively on 18th century. And if you read some of the important works, you will find some of the significant aspects of the transitions that taking place from 17th century and how these 17th century transitions affected the historical processes of the 18th century. And when I read 18th century as a student of history, definitely I would ask some of the important questions, like the nature of Indian polity in the mid 18th century, and secondly I also tried to understand the ways in which recent historiographical writings have challenged the view, and this is also argued by some historians as a dark age. Okay, so the 18th century is argued by some of the historians as a period of dark age. On the contrary, there are historical accounts which suggests that 18th century is a period of economic prosperity. So you have two important conflicting ideas. Which one is true and which one is debatable? We will be able to understand only when we understand the historical interpretations. So I remind you that there are two conflicting views about 18th century. One is one group of scholars try to argue that 18th century is a period of dark age, and secondly, on the contrary, a group of scholars try to refute, saying that 18th century is a period of economic prosperity. And second set of ideas or argument we have whether 18th century is a period of continuity or 18th century is a period of change. This is also an interesting thing that we need to remember, and we will explain one by one. In the examinations also, sometimes you may be asked to write an essay on discuss the nature of Indian polity in the 18th century, or discuss the ways in which historiographical writings have challenged the view that 18th century was a dark age in India. Thirdly, there may be also a question asked how the different interpretations of historians have changed our understanding of the 18th century. And to be precise, there may be questions like, was the 18th century a dark age? Or was the 18th century an economic prosperity? Or similarly, there may be question, was the 18th century India is a period of continuity or change? So why I'm giving all these questions, possible questions, is to make you understand that we need to be sure that any kind of argument or the debate that we will be discussing should be clear to you when you listen to this particular aspect of the discussion. Okay, now the second important aspect we need to remember: who are the historians who worked on the 18th century? Right? Who are the historians who extensively studied the nature and culture of the 18th century? So there are a range of historians who have done extensive scholarly, painstaking research. I would like to make a brief, in fact, an overview of the scholarly studies. And the scholars who worked on 18th century particularly are important, including Jadunath Sarkar. Alright? So historians who have worked on the 18th century therefore differed widely in their ideological orientation. Right. So I just need to give you some important aspects of Jadunath Sarkar. Who is Jadunath Sarkar? What is his take about the 18th century Indian history? And Jadunath Sarkar, for example, was a pioneering historian who worked extensively on Mughal Empire. And the most important fact is that he got the knighthood, the title or rank in 1929, and possibly became the first Indian historian to gain honorary membership in the American Historical Association. Right? And second important historian that we need to remember as far as the 18th century India is concerned is historian R.P. Tripathi. So he also belonged to Allahabad School of Thought. And the third important historian we hardly remember nowadays is historian Tara Chand. He also belonged to Allahabad School of Thought. And another important historian that we need to remember is Ishwari Prasad, Allahabad School of Thought. And the next important historian who also has done extensive scholarly studies on 17th as well as 18th century, particularly on Mughal India, is Professor and historian Irfan Habib. And these are some of these scholars. Okay, I'm not able to give you the detailed picture of those historians who have worked, because that itself needs a couple of hours to give you a detailed account of the historians who have worked on 18th century. But I just wanted to give you the most important scholarly studies made on 17th as well as 18th centuries. Okay, so let's come back to the important aspect of the arguments. What kind of arguments they are making about 18th century, so that we can understand the different dimensions or historical dimensions of the 18th century. Most notably, Jadunath Sarkar, if you read his 5-volume history of Aurangzeb and 4 volumes on the fall of the Mughal Empire and a book on history of Aurangzeb, these are some of the works made by Jadunath Sarkar, particularly on Mughal India. I am not going to talk about Mughal India, but I need to give you a brief reference on the connectivity of how it is relevant in the 18th century. And if you read specifically his history of Aurangzeb, he is the one who criticized the orthodox and the Islamic principles of Aurangzeb, and he also says that religious policy of Aurangzeb was the most important reason for the decline of Mughal Empire. I'm sure most of you may be aware of this. And similarly, he also said that Aurangzeb was, religious fanatic, and it is truly Islamic state religious toleration, and therefore was an impossibility during the 17th century. And similarly, you have other set of ideas started emerging, and particularly during independence and during the post-colonial period. And this school of thought mostly tried to look at the 18th century from the materialist interpretations. It could be studies made by Nurul Hasan, or it could be studies made by Satish Chandra, or Tapan Rai Chowdhury, or maybe Irfan Habib. Because I need to make a brief reference to this particular school of thought. You know, this school of thought is slightly different from the first school of thought which I discussed. And this school of thought interested in the interpretations of materialist perspective. For example, Irfan Habib's work, which is I think very important, Agrarian System of Mughal India 1963, attempts to interpret the Mughal state through Marxist framework. I'm sure you must have studied this important intervention of his scholarly study. And he says that the centralized administration, in a way, over centralization of the Mughal Empire was an instrument of class oppression. And secondly, he also emphasizes that there was a kind of merciless extraction of surplus produce from the peasants. And third important aspect of the discussion is that he also focuses largely on the working of the Mughal financial administration and its impact on the lives of the people. So it's very interesting that how the 18th century, particularly the first half of the 18th century, was studied thoroughly by historians. And now we need to move a little further. What is the latest or recent historiography of the 18th century Indian society? Okay, apart from the studies made by the scholars which I have mentioned above, we also need to update the recent studies made on the 18th century, particularly the first half of the 18th century. And we also find some of the important aspects of the broader historical processes, how it developed. And most importantly, this 18th century debate can be understood from C.A. Bailey's work, Indian Society and the Making of British Empire. And second, as we all know, the popular textbook, and this is also prescribed by the Delhi University, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, From Plassey to Partition. I'm sure all of you know this. And the third important study is also, I think, it's a familiar textbook edited by Seema Alavi and others. The topic and the title of the book is 18th Century in India. And another important scholar, Peter James Marshall, popularly P.J. Marshall, and this is also titled The 18th Century in Indian History. So these are some of the historical works which help us understand the recent debates about the 18th century, right? And the 18th century, therefore, has been a subject of historical debate among scholars. And as I told you earlier, these studies, therefore, try to look at from different perspectives. The 18th century has been, therefore, conventionally viewed by some scholars as a period of decline, anarchy, and economic decay. And it is in this context, there are some scholars who also try to project the 18th century as a dark age. Okay, so if you read Sima Alavi's important edited volume, The 18th Century in India, which attempts to identify these recent debates, how scholars try to identify themselves as proponents of, you know, uh, Dark Age school and the economic prosperity. And before I go into the details of Dark Age or the economic prosperity, we need to remember one thing fundamentally, which is what kind of transition that is taking place in the 18th century. Alright? What kind of transitions took place in the 18th century? For example, the nature of transition from centralized Mughal polity to the emergence of regional confederations. That's the first important development that is taking place in India, modern Indian history. Okay, the nature of transition from centralized Mughal polity to the emergence of regional confederations. In other words, emergence of regional states. It could be Bengal, or it could be Mysore, or it could be Marathas, or it could be Punjab, to name a few. And secondly, the nature of transformation therefore brought about by the increasing role of the East India Company in the social, economic, political, commercial and financial life of the people. So when did this transformation take place? When did this transformation take place? Particularly, we have a phenomenon called 1757, Battle of Plassey. So this is a very, very important development in the history of modern India. So therefore, the transition that took place after the Battle of Plassey and the important historical development that took place after the Battle of Buxar. So these two important battles, I am sure all of us know, therefore played an important role in the establishment of the colonial rule. This is a very, very important and basic historical fact. Now, what kind of change that took place after 1757? If you read P.J. Marshall's the 18th century in Indian history, he argues very clearly that 1757 Battle of Plassey gave the East India Company territorial power. So that's what we are talking about. So the most important aspect in the 18th century is Battle of Plassey, and as P.J. Marshall argues persuasively that 1757 Battle of Plassey therefore gave the East India Company territorial power. And secondly, he also says that the political configuration of India was clearly taking a new shape, which is European power. And thirdly, the 18th century therefore had been a period of revolutionary change, and this is also therefore possible and became a historical reality in the 18th century, and this led to a perpetual economic drain from India. So this obviously is a term coined by Dadabhai Naoroji. So in his books Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, The Wants and Means of India, and another important scholarly study on the commerce of India, you will be able to find the most important aspect called drain of wealth. This is also happening from the 18th century onwards. Now let us come back to the most important part of the argument. Whether 18th century is a period of dark age or it's a period of economic prosperity. What is your idea? Okay, so we will come back to this important aspect. Why this is called a dark age? What happened? What went wrong? If somebody uses a period, or if somebody identifies a period as a dark age, there must be some important social, political, economic decline or difficulties. So what was the situation? How this is identified as a dark age? For example, we need to define very clearly. Those historians who propounded the Dark Age theory argue clearly that the decline of Mughal Empire was followed by the economic and social decline. Alright? Of course, there was a political decline, and this political decline, largely after the death of Aurangzeb and the controversial religious policies and the weak successors of, Aurangzeb, and these situations therefore led to political decline, and this political decline therefore also led to economic and social decline. So this is the clear definition. So now we need to remember who are the historians who are trying to make this theory. For example, there are many studies that can be used to construct this particular part of the discussion. The 18th century was a dark age, and which has been studied by different scholars. For example, British scholars like Henry Beveridge, James Mill, John Marshman, and a few other European administrator historians. Okay, you need to make the distinction very clearly. I am not talking about professional historians here. I'm talking about a particular term, administrator historians, because they have no idea about the basic aspects of professional historical writing. Rather, they try to write something based on the data which was available to them in different repositories. And most importantly, and most notoriously, the person that we are talking about is James Mill. And James Mill, interestingly, he claimed that Indian culture was remarkable only for superstition, ignorance, and mistreatment of women. He's not making any particular claim with reference to 18th century, but this is how he writes in his book, History of British India, James Mill. Okay, so the Dark Age notion therefore started coming in, I think largely after James Mill's interpretation of Indian history. And he is notoriously known for his periodization of Indian history. And how did he periodize Indian history? It's very, very, funny in a way. And he divided the Indian history into three important segments. One is the ancient history was divided by Hindu India, and the medieval history was divided by Muslim India, and the modern India was divided by the British India. So you understand the classification very clearly, and this classification was meticulously used by the colonial government for their divide and rule policy. And James Mill also even makes tall claims and goes to the extent in saying that 18th century was a dark age for a variety of reasons. And what happened therefore? Who were the saviors according to James Mill? He argues that only the establishment of colonial rule saved India from this dark age. Just imagine. This is how James Mill tried to understand history. And when I was reading some of the important articles, whether this was completely approved by Indian historians or whether Indian historians were very critical of James Mill arguments, James Mill's interpretations of history. And one of the most important writings made by historians Romila Thapar and Kunal Chakrabarti, and this article is also available online. And in their study, interpretations of Indian history, I'm sure if you have access to this important article, I'm sure you'll enjoy interpretations of Indian history, an article by Romila Thapar and Kunal Chakrabarti. It is a way of discussion. This article was constructed in a way of question and answer session. And these two important historians tried to be very critical of James Mill. So how did they criticize James Mill? Because these two scholars argue that it was James Mill who began the periodization of Indian history, writing on the basis of religious stratification, such as Hindus, Muslims and the British. And according to Romila Thapar and Kunal Chakrabarti, James Mill did not have first-hand information. That's the reason why I use the term administrative historians. Okay, maybe political historians, not professional historians at all. And James Mill therefore did not have first-hand information about India. And what was his mentality towards India, towards Indian history? These scholars argue his mentality was, we don't need to have that experience. I repeat, we don't need to have that experience. So this was the mentality of James Mill. So that mentality speaks a lot, right? So when I was reading repeatedly this particular writing, I used to wonder how James Mill must have thought about India's history, India's people, this culture, civilization. And most importantly, if you ask a question whether James Mill visited India, whether he knew any of the vernacular languages of India, it's really $1 million question, because James Mill never visited India except in his imagination, right? He never visited India except in his imagination. Okay, so the foundation for dockage therefore was strongly laid down by James Mill and others. And what about the attitude of Indian scholars? So here there are interpretations that we need to remember, that Indian scholars also therefore over a period of time tried to suggest, not necessarily following the ideological aspirations or ideological aspects of the British historians, because Indian scholars have their own reasons to identify that 18th century was a period of dark age. So who are the Indian historians? As I told you, Jodhanath Sarkar. And secondly, you have Ishwari Prasad and historian Tara Chand. And the most important argument, as I told you, the proponents of this particular school of thought, the Dark Age or a Dark Century school of thought argued that the decline of Mughal power was due to administrative and religious policies, which we have already discussed. And these scholars also maintain that the 18th century was a dark age as it was characterized by the decline in all areas of life, from the economic to the political and to the cultural. So therefore, you find a range of evidences which seem to suggest that the 18th century was a period of dark age. And let me be very specific as far as Jardinath Sarkar's argument. What makes him to argue that 18th century was a period of dark age? For example, perhaps the earliest interpretation of the 18th century is contained in Jardinath Sarkar's History of Bengal, Volume 2, and A Fall of Mughal Empire, Volume 4. And similarly, Jardinath Sarkar also wrote 5 volumes titled The Fall of Mughal Empire. And so very importantly, he studied Aurangzeb's religious policies. So for him, the most important factor which led to the decline of the downfall of Mughal Empire was, Aurangzeb. And particularly, he also studied a lot about Deccan campaigns. And he explored the decline of Mughal Empire, institutions and society, and he attributed the decline to Aurangzeb's faulty policies, controversial policies. And similarly, he also studied the peasant rebellions that destroyed Mughal political stability. And he stated that the political instability was due to Hindu reaction to Aurangzeb's Mughal orthodoxy. Okay, that's very, very important. I repeat this particular argument, that the political instability was due to the Hindu reaction to Aurangzeb's Muslim orthodoxy. And he also therefore alleges that Aurangzeb's discriminatory religious policies for the rise of non-Muslim social groups such as Sikhs and the Marathas, they also constituted the regional states in the first and second half of the 18th century. So therefore, he finds that there are a range of reactionary groups, reactionary responses to the growing threats from the non-Islamic groups, particularly the Sikhs and Marathas. This is also a point that we need to remember. And secondly, the proponents of the Dark Age school of thought argue, listen to me very carefully, this is a very, very important aspect of the discussion. The proponents of the Dark Age school of thought therefore argue that the decline of Mughal Empire, regional powers failed to establish empires. Right? So on the one side you have decline of Mughal Empire. So for them, therefore, that's the end of the story. So the regional powers, of course, it started emerging, and these regional powers therefore were failed to establish empires. Which means once the Mughal Empire declined, there was no empire. So therefore, there was no possibility of economic stability. So therefore, no possibility of social stability. So therefore, there is a decline in all walks of life. And secondly, we also need to remember how historians therefore try to come out with their own ideas to suggest that 18th century was a period of dark age. For example, these scholars try to argue that there was a collapse of central institution, right? Collapse of central institution, and a decline in fiscal structure. That's also another important reason. And there was an opposition. There were opposition movements from Marathas and Sikhs, as I told you, and the decline in trade and stability in agriculture. That's also we need to remember. So these were some of the reasons identified. And similarly, Ishwari Prasad, in his book India in the 18th century, he makes a very, very solid argument saying that 18th century was a politically chaotic. 18th century was a politically chaotic, economically crisis-ridden, and socially and religiously a period of conflict. Okay, I repeat, this is a very, very interesting argument. So why Ishwari Prasad is trying to understand the 18th century was a period of darkness, he has his own reason, and this reason or these reasons also therefore were contextualized or substantiated with facts. I repeat once again the Ishwari Prasad's argument. 18th century India was politically chaotic, economically crisis-ridden, and socially and religiously a period of conflict. And he also contends that the individual character of rules and their administrative and religious policies were responsible for Mughal decline. So this also, according to him, led to economic stagnation. Right? And this is therefore a very, very important aspect of the discussion, how and why 18th century therefore is seen as a period of dark age, because there was a political decline, there was a cultural decline, there was economic decline, decline in trade and commerce. And it is in this context we need to see a new school of thought is also started emerging, which is proudly identified as Aligarh School of Thought, Aligarh Muslim University, where historians like Satish Chandra and Irfan Habib, they try to argue through materialist interpretations, right? And here Satish Chandra and Irfan Habib therefore proposed an unprecedented structural and materialist analysis of the decline of Mughal Empire. So what are their arguments? What made them to argue that 18th century was in a way, a kind of dark age because of so many conflicting and conflicts and confrontations between different stakeholders in the state? And the most important argument of these two scholars, Irfan Habib and Satish Chandra, was that the structural weakness of the centralized revenue collection system of the empire as the reason for its fiscal crisis. Okay, so the centralized revenue collection, according to these two scholars, therefore played an important role for the decline. And similarly, Satish Chandra's argument was that fiscal crisis was caused by the incapability of the imperial officers to collect revenue smoothly. And he also attributed the political turmoil to the decline of Jagirs. So the political turmoil also was due to the decline of Jagirdar system or the Jagirdars. So what you call as Jagirdari crisis. This also led to the 18th century crisis. And these scholars also argue that Jagirs had become infertile or unproductive, and the intensification of the difference between the estimated revenue and the actual revenue therefore was creating all these crises. So the intensification of the difference between estimated revenue, which is JAMA, and hasil, actual yields. So this affected the very income of the Mughals. So therefore this led to the decline of the Mughals. And they also argue that the centralized Mughal polity created a range of issues, a series of issues. For example, if you read Irfan Habib's work, that he argues that the Mughal Empire was highly centralized from Akbar's time onwards. So this centralization therefore created complexities on land tax on the one hand, and the revenue collection on the other hand, and the functioning of Mansabdari and Jagirdari system therefore also came under a severe attack because of the centralized system of functioning. And therefore administration was a dominant factor in the entire decline of the system. So the unrestricted authority of Jagirdars therefore led to the gradual decline of economy. So as I told you, the political decline therefore led to economic decline. So here we have the instance how the centralized political system therefore gradually led to the economic decline. And there was also therefore increased pressure of revenue for Jagirdars. So this led to the peasants uprising. So the more there was a pressure on Jagirdars, the more pressure on the peasants. So there were conflicts between peasants and the Jagirdars. So obviously this led to peasant uprising against the state. So this also was, there was also a breakdown in collaboration between zamindars and Jagirdars. So this is also one of the important issues that we need to remember. And the zamindars therefore became leaders of peasant uprising in most of the cases. So this led to agrarian crisis. So what is most important therefore is the zamindars therefore played a very important role, and this led to agrarian crisis, and this agrarian crisis led to political uncertainty. So political uncertainty or political decline led to economic decline, and the economic crisis also therefore furthered the political uncertainty. So therefore, in a way, this economic crisis and political instability therefore, among other reasons, have been identified by scholars as therefore the 18th century is a period of dark age. Now, on contrary to this particular interpretation, that we also need to remember how 18th century has been studied by a group of historians as a period of economic prosperity. So this is how it's an important discussion that we need to have, because on the one side there is a clear idea which suggests that 18th century was a period of dark age because a decline in the Mughal Empire, the over-centralization, fiscal crisis, economic decline, political uncertainty. On the other side, you have 18th century being argued as a period of economic prosperity. What kind of sources we have to suggest that 18th century was a period of economic prosperity? Here we go. What is the argument of this economic prosperity school of thought? What is the definition of economic prosperity? So those historians who proposed economic prosperity in the 18th century argue that of course there was a political turmoil, right? They have no problem with this particular decline. The 18th century, according to him, therefore was a problematic period. Therefore, they argue that the 18th century there was a political turmoil. Nevertheless, this political turmoil did not stop the emergence of regional kingdoms. I repeat once again, this is very, very important. I just try to emphasize this. So 18th century, of course, there was a political turmoil, largely due to the decline of Mughals. But that doesn't mean that everything went wrong, because on the contrary, you have the emergence of regional kingdoms, and these regional states, therefore, along with their political stability, also began to assert their economic growth and development. That's the point. That's very interesting. So the regional kingdoms, for example, in Bengal, or it could be Awadh, or it could be Mysore, or it could be Marathas, or it could be Punjab. So these regional kingdoms therefore started reviving the political stability, economic stability, and cultural revivalism. So therefore, it's important to suggest that 18th century is also equally important to understand that because it is also a period of economic prosperity. For example, who are the historians who try to argue that 18th century was a period of economic prosperity? What are the case studies that they have? Right? Most importantly, if you read historians' work like Sanjay Subramanian, Muzaffar Alam, and again P.J. Marshall. So these studies therefore tell us a lot about the economic prosperity, school of thought. For example, the 18th century, according to Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam, need not to be viewed from the point of view of the Mughals only. So he is simply provoking the scholarly community. So why are only looking at the Mughals? You can also therefore try to find some of the important developments in the regional states. For example, look at the case study of Bengal, look at what was going on in Mysore, look at what was going in Marathas. So what happened in Punjab? Why you are always sticking to the Mughal decline as the only historical incident that took place in India? So therefore he widens, these scholars, particularly Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam, therefore try to widen the historical interpretation. In a way, they were the one who tried to widen the scope of historiography. For example, in their edited works, Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam, the Mughal state 1526 to 1750, they argue, because they make a very interesting argument that Delhi and Agra might have witnessed a decline. Remember, Delhi and Agra might have witnessed a decline in the 18th century, but provinces, I mean the regional states like Bengal, Awadh, Punjab, Marathas, were witnessing dynamic changes and economic reorientation. Oh, this is how I think we need to focus more. On the one side, there were historians, there are debates which talk about that 18th century was a period of dark age, simply because they are emphasizing their case studies mostly on Mughals. But on the contrary, Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam or P.J. Marshall, they suggest that Delhi and Agra might have witnessed a decline, but provinces such as the regional states, Bengal, Awadh, Punjab, were witnessing dynamic changes and economic reorientation. So this is very important because these historians therefore focus on the concept of decentralization and regionalization. So these terms are very, very important to those scholars who try to argue that 18th century was a period of economic prosperity. So these scholars therefore continue to emphasize notions such as decentralization. For example, there was a centralization in Mughal polity, and there was a decline in centralization, and therefore this decline was followed by decentralization in the regional states, and decentralization therefore led to regionalization. So they simply therefore ask a question: why do we need to use the term collapse and decline as the key words for the century? Now this is a very intriguing question. Okay, so those of us therefore who think that 18th century as a period of dark age, therefore we need to remember that 18th century is also a period of decentralization, because a range of states started coming up, regional states started emerging, and therefore regionalization started coming up, and therefore we need to be little critical when we use the term collapse, like collapse or decline. So this is a very, very important argument. So these historians therefore continue to focus on the concept of decentralization, regionalization, collapse, and decline therefore for them became a critical approach. So we need to be little careful when we use the term very loosely. The decline of Mughal Empire was followed by the decline of entire history. For example, if you read Muzaffar Alam's work, The Crisis of Empire in the Mughal North India, and Christopher Bailey's Rulers, Townsmen and Bazaars, and Philip Calkin's The Formation of a Regionally Oriented Ruling Bengal, Andre Wink, Land and Sovereignty in India. So these scholarly studies therefore again emphasize the vitality and intermediary structures of power in Awadh, Bengal, Punjab and Maratha regions. So our focus of attention here is to understand that how therefore 18th century is important in the context of the growing historical debate. So these scholars therefore try to understand the 18th century as a period of economic prosperity, because largely their argument was the decline of Mughal Empire did not stop the regional powers. I repeat once again, the decline of Mughal Empire did not stop the regional powers from establishing the political stability, establishing from the economic prosperity, and therefore these regional states were able to maintain the economic prosperity. So that's the reason why these scholars identify the 18th century as a period of economic prosperity. And here one important example that I would like to give why this is 18th century therefore for them and a period of economic prosperity, because these scholars argue that there was a redistribution of resources rather than decline. So there was no decline, rather there was a redistribution of resources. For example, commercial classes continue to be the agents of growth, particularly trade and commerce, money economy. So the decline of Mughals does not mean that there was a decline in trade. So the decline of Mughals does not mean that there was a decline in commerce. So the decline of Mughal does not mean there was a decline in money economy. I hope you understand. It's very clear. So on the contrary, the decline of Mughal did not make any major changes in the history in the polity and in economy. For example, it's a very interesting aspect that there was a money economy in the 18th century, largely because of the prosperity of the regional states. There was a market system. There's a well-developed market system, and the most importantly, there was a banking family called Jagat Seth. So when I was reading this Jagat Seth family, I was really amazed to understand some of the important aspects, because they were the one who had the privilege of minting coins in Bengal, and they were the one who were doing remittance of revenue for the Nawabs of Bengal. So the Jagat Seth, which means literally translated as a banker of the world, was a title conferred on Fateh Chand. That's very, very important. So I'm sure those of you studied the rise of modern West. There was a family called Medici family. Yeah. So Medici family in Italy. So I find there are more similarities than differences between the Jagat Seth, banker of the world in Bengal, and the Medici family in Italy. So these families, this powerful financing family and the banking family, played a very important role in the decision making of the political class. For example, this particular banking family performed for the government of Bengal like the Bank of England. That's very, very interesting. And it was the receiver of finance and the treasurer of the government. And the zamindars therefore paid revenue through this banking system. Remember, so how powerful this Jagat Seth banking family. And in fact, the Nawabs of Bengal remitted the annual payment to Delhi through the same bank. That's another important dimension of this powerful banking family. So it minted coins and purchased much of the foreign bullions, which mean gold or maybe silver, imported into Bengal, thereby adding considerably to its annual income. So what I'm trying to say here is this particular family played very important role in strengthening the economic prosperity, economic stability of the 18th century Indian economy, right? So it's very important. This Jagat Seth banking family, a family of traders, controlled in a way half of the Bengal's economy. It's just unbelievable, right? The family of this community controlled half of the Bengal's economy. As P.J. Marshall rightly points out in his book Bengal British Bridgehead 1740 to 1828, he argues very clearly that merchants and bankers played an important role in the political and revenue system. And they were not the only political economic community. So they were also playing very important role in the political field. Okay, so I think it's a very, very important topic to be discussed. This banking family therefore ensured the economy of the state is properly maintained and the stability of the economic system is properly monitored, and therefore these scholars argument also makes sense to suggest that 18th century is a period of economic stability. And lastly, I need to make a brief reference to historian Rajat Datta in his important work, History, Society, Economy and Polity in the 18th Century India. Okay, he's also making this important argument that economic prosperity could be a very, very important historical processes of the 18th century. For example, Rajat Datta in his study makes the following argument that there was an influential intermediaries and therefore there was economic stability. When we say influential intermediaries, it could be zamindars, most importantly it could be bankers, and so on and so forth. And he also suggests there was a vibrant agricultural economy. So since his case study is mostly restricted to Bengal, it's also important to understand that there was a vibrant agricultural economy. And third important point, as argued by Rajat Datta, is there was a national and international commercial activities. There were national and international commercial activities. So how would you say that 18th century was a period of dark age? If it is completely a dark age, there would not have been any international or national transaction, at least to some extent. And the next important argument of Rajat Datta is there were changing notions of authority and jurisdiction, because there was a state and a landed property, there was new revenue experiments in Bengal, and there was permanent settlement, as we all know, and there was economic intervention, impact of indigenous capital and business. There was powerful regional states, emergence of market, and the nature of agrarian commercialism, according to him, was powerfully felt in the 18th century. And therefore, it's very important. I need to summarize here my discussion. Why there are scholars therefore continue to argue that 18th century was a period of economic prosperity. For example, there are two studies briefly I mentioned. One is John Maclean in his study Land and Local Kingship in the 18th century Bengal. If you have time, then maybe you can read this book. I repeat once again, Land and Local Kingship in the 18th century Bengal. He argues persuasively that these intermediaries were the oil of the Indian state system. I repeat, this is a very powerful argument. According to John Maclean, the 18th century Bengal had powerful intermediaries, including bankers. So these intermediaries played a very important role for the stability of the economy, and therefore ensured the political stability, because these intermediaries were the oil of the Indian state system in the era of political decentralization in the 18th century. So that speaks a lot about the economic prosperity. That speaks a lot about the economic stability. That speaks louder about how the political stability was in the 18th century, therefore, was a historical reality. So many of these intermediaries, therefore, occupied a dual role. Remember, it's not zamindars who are just collecting only the tax. They also were doing a dual role, like zamindars as well as state servants. So therefore, they played a very, very important role. And the second study, P.J. Marshall's, and he also talks about the role played by the zamindars, intermediaries, because he argues that the zamindars as a class carried local political authority in the 18th century, because that we hardly witness in the 17th century. So this also was one of the reasons why scholars therefore try to understand 18th century as a period of economic prosperity, because zamindars had dual role to play. As a class carried local political authority in 18th century. And similarly, the Mughals in the 17th century often pressurized these zamindars for their vested interest. That was the 17th century phenomenon. But now in the 18th century, zamindars played a new role. For example, as a result, they continued to rebel against the Mughal rulers, because the more you give pressure to the zamindars, they obviously reacted. Here in the 18th century, since they had dual role to play, it was a different scenario altogether. So nevertheless, in the 18th century, the zamindars received a lot of importance. I emphasize, the zamindars in the 18th century received a lot of importance in the new political order. The new political order, we mean the emergence of regional states, particularly Bengal, Awadh, and so on and so forth. So this political renewal, therefore, also with the influential intermediaries, created positive environment for economic prosperity. I repeat, these emergence of powerful intermediaries, therefore created a positive environment for economic prosperity and financial profitability in the regional states. Right? I hope you understand the discussion, the 18th century debate. So we began the discussion how the historical interpretation identifies the reasons or the causes which led to the decline of Mughals. And secondly, we also understand how there were historical interpretations or historians who tried to identify the 18th century as a period of dark age and what were their arguments. And thirdly, we also try to understand why historians try to identify 18th century as a period of economic prosperity. Right? So it is really a complex century. 18th century, personally, I feel that it's a very complex period, because there are so many things, so many transitions. The Battle of Plassey, the Battle of Buxar, the decline of Mughal on the one side, and the colonial intervention in the second half of the 18th century. So therefore it is really a complex story. Nevertheless, I would say this is one of the most interesting periods in the history of India, because we get a range of ideas from different scholars, as I told you in the morning. Therefore, history is the most interesting subject among all subjects. Right? History is the most interesting subject among all subjects. You know why? Because history is a continuous process of interaction between past and present. Similarly, history is also a very interesting subject, largely because it is an unending dialogue between you historians and your facts. So if you like this discussion, please make your comments, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I will try and I will get back to you. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you for taking your precious time. See you in the next lecture. Bye. Namaste.